Imagine lying in bed, just staring at the ceiling after landing a massive promotion, or maybe a really coveted job offer.
Right. Everyone in your life is thrilled for you, popping champagne.
Exactly. But privately, in the dark, there's this icy little voice whispering, like, they made a mistake. Any day now, they're going to realize you have absolutely no idea what you're doing.
Well, it is just this profound, really isolating dread. And the cruelest part is that it usually strikes right when things are objectively going very, very well.
NASA actually tracked this phenomenon, which I found mind-blowing. They surveyed their high-performing engineers, and we are talking literal rocket scientists here, people pushing the boundaries of human achievement, and they found that nearly 70% of them reported feeling like they didn't belong in their roles.
70%. That is wild.
Right, 70%. And Harvard psychologists have mapped out an even more bizarre paradox. They found that the deeper you dive into a complex subject, the more your brain actually misreads your expanding awareness of the unknown as concrete evidence that you are fundamentally unqualified.
Because from the outside, high achievers project absolute certainty, So when you're sitting in a meeting feeling like a complete fraud, you assume you are an anomaly. You're the only one.
Yeah, you think you're broken.
Exactly. But the reality is you're likely sitting in a room full of people who are all secretly convinced they are the only ones faking it.
So if you have ever felt that invisible weight, this deep dive is for you. We're pulling apart the neuroscience of imposter syndrome today.
We are going to explore how a highly active prefrontal cortex accidentally triggers a primal threat response, and how that biological glitch spills over into our daily workplace habits.
And most importantly, the actual neurological levers we can pull to rewire these false alarms. Because feeling like a fraud isn't a character flaw. It's actually a biological signal that your brain is processing information at an incredibly sophisticated level.
Right. To see why highly capable brains misfire like this, we have to look at the physical architecture of how we process our own competence. You essentially have two systems operating at the exact same time.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So first, the prefrontal cortex is your executive center. It evaluates objective evidence, synthesizes complex data, forms your rational self-concept. Like, this is the region that knows you have a degree and a verifiable track record of success.
Logical part.
Right. But then there is the amygdala, which is the emotional alarm system. And the central issue here is that the amygdala doesn't just scan your environment for physical danger.
It scans for social exposure, right?
Exactly. It scanned intensely for social exposure. It treats a drop in social status or the threat of being found out by your peers with the exact same neurochemical urgency as, like, a physical predator in the room.
Because in our evolutionary history, being cast out of the tribe meant you wouldn't survive the winter. You'd be totally alone.
Yeah. The amygdala perceives the risk of professional exposure as a literal physical survival threat. So when it detects that risk, it completely bypasses the slower logical prefrontal cortex and just floods your system with stress hormones to force you into action.
It's like, well, the analogy I thought of is, it's like having a hyperactive smoke detector that someone accidentally hardwired directly into your home's sprinkler system.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, because you're just making toast, giving a standard project update to your team, but the detector can't tell the difference between a toaster and a raging house fire.
It just senses heat, panics, and ruins your entire kitchen to save your life.
Exactly, and that miscalibration seems incredibly common.
It is, and it's actively intensified by what researchers at Cornell identified as the reverse Dunning-Kruger effect.
Okay, we're all familiar with standard Dunning-Kruger, right? Like incompetence breeding extreme overconfidence. The guy who thinks he's an expert after reading one article.
Yeah, that guy. But the flip side is a fascinating mechanism.
Yeah.
Highly skilled individuals systematically underestimate their competence relative to others.
Because as your expertise expands, your prefrontal cortex maps out all the nuances, right? All the edge cases, and this massive remaining unknown territory of your field.
Yes, but the amygdala lacks that sophisticated nuance. It just sees this massive, newly discovered territory of things you don't know, reads it as vulnerability, and triggers the alarm.
Oh, wow. Combine that with the brain's inherent negativity bias, which obviously evolved to prioritize threat data over safety data, and your brain starts actively looping a highlight reel of your minor mistakes.
The awkward interactions, the slight typos.
While aggressively filtering out your major wins and successful projects as like irrelevant statistical noise.
It's brutal, and if the brain is hitting this panic button all day, that physiological stress has to leak out into our daily habits somehow,
Right, which brings us to the 5 distinct behavioral profiles, or flavors of imposter syndrome, identified by Dr. Valerie Young.
And it's important to note they rarely operate in neat isolation. You're usually a mix.
Like Jennifer, the software engineer highlighted in the sources. She was a first-generation college graduate who landed a job in big tech, and her baseline state was a grueling hybrid of two specific profiles: the perfectionist and the expert.
Yeah, the perfectionist profile is driven by a highly punitive binary evaluation system. So for Jennifer, a 95% success rate wasn't an A-, it was an absolute failure.
Which sounds exhausting.
It is. The research links this specific behavior to chronic cortisol elevation. Her brain was locked in a constant state of hypervigilance, just endlessly scanning her own code for the missing 5% to prove her underlying fear that she didn't belong there.
And she combined that perfectionism with the expert
Yeah.
profile, right? The sources said she kept a private, detailed log of every mistake she made just to build a case against herself.
Right. She would endlessly research and delay, pushing her code, feeling perpetually underqualified no matter how many tutorials she finished.
But wait, looking at this objectively, isn't a relentless drive for continuous learning exactly what you want in an engineer? Like, isn't that a good thing?
Well, on the surface, continuous learning looks like a massive asset, but the neuroscience reveals a critical difference in the biological driver of that behavior.
Okay, how so?
Healthy learning is driven by the brain's reward centers, curiosity and dopamine. But the imposter expert profile is driven by fear and a hyperactive anterior cingulate cortex.
The anterior cingulate cortex, that's the brain's uncertainty detector, right?
Exactly. It constantly measures expected outcomes against potential risks. So the endless research isn't actually about acquiring knowledge. It's an attempt to completely eliminate uncertainty to neutralize a perceived threat.
Oh, I see. So they're reading that 10th book or running that 50th simulation because the brain won't release the inhibitory signals holding them back until the risk is mathematically at zero.
Which, in a complex work environment, is literally impossible. The learning just morphs into a sophisticated, highly praised delay tactic.
That is wild. And I guess that leads directly into the third behavioral profile, the superwoman or superman.
Right. If you can't eliminate the uncertainty, you try to outrun it.
This profile believes they have to fundamentally outperform everyone around them by like 300% just to justify their seat at the table.
Yeah, they take on extra projects, work through the weekends, and essentially weaponize their own stamina against their insecurity.
Which inevitably guarantees systemic burnout. You're attempting to use sheer physical output to silence a neurochemical alarm. It's totally physiologically unsustainable.
Absolutely. And then there are the profiles rooted deeply in avoidance, like the natural genius. This one usually forms in early childhood.
Like the kids who breeze through elementary school without ever having to study.
Yes. If that was you, your prefrontal cortex formed a self-concept built entirely on effortless success.
So when that individual eventually encounters a complex, difficult challenge as an adult, the very physical act of struggling is processed, like not as a normal learning curve, but as empirical proof of fraudulence.
Exactly. If they have to sweat to solve a problem, their brain assumes they must be an imposter.
Which often turns them into the final profile, the soloist. The soloist views asking for help, or even basic collaboration, as a flashing neon sign exposing their inadequacy.
It's pure self-preservation. If you secretly believe your work is fundamentally flawed, the absolute last thing you want is a mentor or a manager looking closely over your shoulder.
But that just isolates them completely. It cuts off the exact feedback loops that could actually correct their distorted self-perception.
Right. And you would think that for someone caught in these loops, landing a massive promotion or finally deploying a flawless project would cure the imposter feeling.
But the data says otherwise, doesn't it? External success actually pours gasoline on the fire.
It really does. It's one of the most counterintuitive findings in the psychological literature. Every single time you hit an external milestone, you automatically raise your internal baseline.
Plus, success brings increased visibility. If your amygdala is terrified of social exposure, a promotion just places a much brighter, hotter spotlight on you. You now have a much farther height to fall from.
It is a brutal biological paradox. The higher you climb, the more intense the invisible vertigo becomes.
And this vertigo isn't just an individual nuisance. The sources noted it's costing the U.S. economy an estimated $300 billion annually in lost productivity, burnout-induced medical leave, and turnover.
The scope crosses every major industry: law, medicine, tech, the arts. But it's vital to examine the demographics here, too.
Right. Researchers at the University of Texas found imposter syndrome spikes significantly in environments where an individual is a minority, whether that's by gender, race, or socioeconomic background.
Because the brain is constantly scanning for threats and cues of safety. If the physical environment or the corporate culture is constantly reminding you that you are an outlier, the imposter feeling isn't a cognitive distortion at all.
It's a highly accurate, rational reading of a room that signals your belonging is conditional.
Precisely. We will certainly return to that environmental factor before we close, but nestled within this overwhelming systemic pressure, there is a surprising pivot in the data.
Oh yeah, the Columbia Business School study. I love this part.
Me too. They examined complex problem-solving teams and discovered that individuals experiencing moderate levels of self-doubt consistently outperformed both the highly confident and the highly unconfident groups.
The irony is incredible. So the exact self-doubt keeping you awake, staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning, is actively making you more meticulous, more ethical, and significantly better at anticipating edge cases.
Right. It forces you to double-check the data before presenting it.
So the goal of this deep dive, then, isn't to lobotomize the doubt. It's to demote it.
Right.
Let the doubt flag potential risks, but stop letting it dictate your actual decisions.
Exactly. And if we want to recalibrate that hyperactive smoke detector, we cannot simply positive think our way out of it. Cognitive strategies fail if the physiological baseline is in chaos.
We have to address the biology of the brain first.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the prefrontal cortex, your rational braking system, requires immense metabolic energy to function. When you are in a state of chronic stress, elevated cortisol physically disrupts the neural connectivity in the prefrontal cortex.
So your ability to logically evaluate your own competence literally shuts down, handing complete control over to the emotional alarm system.
Basic neurochemistry plays a massive role here, like omega-3 fatty acids found in foods like salmon or walnuts physically support the structural integrity of the prefrontal cortex.
While conversely, blood sugar spikes from highly processed foods create neurochemical volatility. That mimics the physiological symptoms of anxiety, tricking the brain into thinking it's under active threat.
Right, but the absolute most powerful biological lever we have is sleep. A pivotal study from UC Berkeley demonstrated that sleep deprivation increases amygdala reactivity by a staggering 60%.
Wait, 60% just from a lack of sleep.
Just from running on 5 or 6 hours. Let's look at the actual mechanics of that. Why does losing just a couple of hours of sleep cause the amygdala to overreact so violently?
Because during deep sleep cycles, the brain clears out metabolic waste and neurotoxins, right? And, crucially, it also recalibrates the neural pathways connecting the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala.
Exactly. Without adequate sleep, that physical connection is severely weakened. The prefrontal brakes are essentially severed from the amygdala engine.
Think about the superwoman or expert profiles we just discussed. They feel like frauds, so they stay up until 3 a.m., compulsively over-preparing for a morning presentation.
And by doing so, they completely prevent that neurochemical reset.
They are walking into the office the next morning with an amygdala that is 60% more reactive to perceived threats, biologically guaranteeing they'll feel like even more of an imposter. It is literally a self-fulfilling physiological prophecy.
It really is. So stabilizing your biology is step 1. Step 2 involves manipulating your physical environment through a concept known as environmental priming.
I thought this was a brilliant neurological hack. You deliberately alter your visual field to change your cognitive state.
Right, so if you structure your desk to feature tangible, objective evidence of your competence, a printed email from a tough mentor detailing a success, an award, a physical prototype you designed, your brain processes those visual cues before you even consciously think about them.
It preloads the rational processing system with defensive ammunition before the emotional brain can even sound the alarm.
Exactly. And once the biology and the environment are stabilized, we can start deploying daily psychological protocols to rebuild the brain's internal narrative.
Because standing in front of a mirror, reciting empty affirmations like, "I am a brilliant genius," is worse than useless.
Oh, absolutely. The brain's threat detection system operates strictly on evidence. If you feed it an affirmation that radically contradicts its current internal model, it will immediately reject it as false data.
You have to retrain the neural pathways using undeniable facts. The sources highlight the practice of keeping a credibility anchor document.
Right. There is a powerful case study in the research about Daniel, a product manager in Austin. He was a natural genius type who hit a massive wall when his job scaled up in complexity.
And his initial reaction was sheer panic. So to counter it, he built a competence journal. But he didn't write down his feelings. He logged one piece of objective, undeniable evidence every single day.
A complex software bug he resolved. A hostile stakeholder meeting he successfully de-escalated.
By doing this daily, Daniel was actively forcing his prefrontal cortex to process and store success data. He was intentionally overriding the evolutionary negativity bias that would normally discard those wins into the mental trash can.
And after 2 months, he had 60 concrete data points. Before stepping into high-stakes performance reviews, he would sit and read through a dozen of them.
The imposter voice didn't miraculously disappear, but the sheer weight of the objective evidence finally drowned it out. He anchored his confidence in reality.
Another critical protocol is dismantling the imposter filter we apply to external feedback. When someone compliments your work, the reflexive response is almost always to minimize it.
Constantly. Oh, anyone could have done it, or I just got lucky with the timing.
Right, but every single time you deflect praise like that, you are strengthening the neural pathway that rejects positive data. You are actively training your brain to assume that all praise is fundamentally flawed or unearned.
So the most effective countermeasure is fiercely simple, but surprisingly difficult to execute. When someone praises your work, just say thank you. You have to allow the positive data to physically enter your cognitive system.
We also have to reframe the struggle itself. Stanford's extensive research on growth mindset shows we need to consciously shift from threat mode to learning mode.
So when you hit a roadblock and catch yourself thinking, I should already know how to do this, you swap it with, I am currently building the capacity to do this. It completely changes the neurochemical response to difficulty.
And when the emotional alarm inevitably does trigger, despite all these protocols, we can look to acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT.
This framework teaches us to alter our relationship with our thoughts rather than fighting them. Because fighting an intrusive thought requires focusing immense attention on it, which paradoxically reinforces the neural link.
The core technique is about creating psychological distance. Instead of internalizing the feeling and saying, I am a fraud, you literally frame it to yourself as, I am noticing that the imposter thought is showing up right now.
That linguistic shift is profound. By saying, I notice, you immediately engage the prefrontal cortex to observe the amygdala's emotional output. You separate your core identity from the passing neurochemical storm.
You observe the alarm blaring without assuming the house is actually on fire.
It reclaims your agency instantly. I actually love the story of Marcus, a high school principal in Atlanta.
Oh, the soloist type.
Yeah, the classic soloist. 22 years in education, and he never asked for help because he was terrified it would expose his perceived incompetence. When he was finally offered a massive district superintendent role, he spent weeks trying to reject it, thoroughly convinced he was a fraud.
He eventually confessed this paralyzing fear to a retiring superintendent,
Who gave him a totally paradigm-shifting piece of advice. The older man looked at him and said, Marcus, the leaders who think they have everything figured out are the ones I worry about the most.
It completely shattered Marcus's entire framework.
It did. He realized his anxiety wasn't a defect. It was proof that he understood the gravity and complexity of the work. He took the job, intentionally hired people who were smarter than him to cover his blind spots, and now tells his young staff on day one, the doubt is the credential.
The doubt is the credential. That perfectly encapsulates the Columbia Business School findings. Imposter syndrome is not a diagnosis of your incompetence. It is a predictable glitch in a highly capable brain.
It's simply the emotional amygdala misinterpreting the complexities of a modern career as an ancient survival threat.
By identifying the specific ways your brain tries to protect you, stabilizing your physiological baseline with sleep, and relentlessly feeding your executive function objective evidence, you can transform debilitating anxiety into a careful, highly productive superpower.
But there is one final critical piece of the puzzle we must acknowledge before we wrap up. We focused heavily on internal neurochemistry, behavioral profiles, and cognitive habits. Yet, self-assessment does not happen in a vacuum.
No, it doesn't. As we noted earlier with the University of Texas data, environments matter immensely. If you have optimized your sleep, maintained your credibility anchors, practiced psychological distance, and the alarm is still deafening every single day, well, the problem might not be your mindset at all.
You have to step back and critically ask yourself, if your workplace, your leadership structure, or your social circle is actively signaling that your belonging is conditional,
Sometimes the imposter feeling isn't a cognitive distortion to be fixed. It is a completely rational response to a toxic environment that simply needs to be abandoned.
It's a really profound distinction to leave you with today. Your self-perception is just a learned habit of the mind, constantly shaped by the rooms you stand in and the biology you maintain. And thankfully, the human brain is remarkably adaptable.
It is always capable of learning a new way to operate.
So, the next time you are sitting in a high-stakes meeting and that icy little voice whispers in your ear, remember, you don't have to rip the smoke detector off the wall. You just have to remind your brain that you're only making toast. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. See you next time.